and I'm absolutely confident that he will move a lot of troops to make sure that he does that quickly. He won't want to do that over time. He'll want to use overwhelming force to force Ukraine out quickly and demonstrate that Putin's back in control. But you can't magic up these forces. They're going to have to be moved from somewhere, and therefore almost certainly from the front line.
The Russia analyst and former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, Michael Clark, wrote in the Times over the weekend saying this is President Zelensky's biggest gamble yet. Do you agree with that? And if so, at what point will we know whether his gamble has paid off?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge respecter of Michael. Michael and I work quite closely together at Sky. And of course, I think what's interesting is that Michael looks at it more from an academic perspective. I look at it more from an operational perspective as a seasoned warfighter. I'm not sure I would create the word gamble around this. It's a gamble if he was trying to take and hold ground and it was going to be incredibly bloody and lose a hell of a lot of kit and equipment. I think it's probably an inspired military strategy, excuse me, because it has caused President Putin to think. It has secured quite a lot of territory. It has relieved pressure on the front line. And I'm not sure that's a gamble. I think that's a really clever use of deception, of creating innovation on the front line. But the proof of the pudding, as we talked about earlier, will be how long it lasts for and what price Ukraine actually pays for this. That's the only part in it which I suspect I'm questioning. But I think it's an inspired move, genuinely inspired move, providing Ukraine doesn't pay a too high a price for it, because it tickles the underbelly of President Putin. It's forcing him to start to prioritize resources in the defense of Russia. He doesn't have that many, and if you take assets away from the front line, that will help ease the pressure on Ukraine.
Yeah, what kind of response do you think we'll see from the Russians inside Ukraine? Already in recent days, we've seen an attack on a deadly attack on a shopping centre in Konstantinivka. President Zelensky's accused Russia of being responsible for the fire at the giant nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. Do you think we will see more of that in the coming days?
Well, yeah, I think we've got to be careful joining the dots here. The Zaporizhia issue, at the moment, it always puts it on the front line. But Russian forces have occupied the biggest single nuclear site in Europe. They should not be doing that, and then firing out from that at Ukrainian soldiers invites fire back. But of course, then the Russians say, well, you're firing a nuclear reactor. It is worth bearing in mind, we get excited about the nuclear threat, but those reactors are designed to take a direct hit from a commercial airliner flying into them. They're not going to be damaged by a couple of hand grenades or some artillery fire. What is worrying is when you lose electricity, because obviously you lose the ability to cool them. My understanding is that there are about 20 standby generators. They need 4 working at any one time, and therefore, that shouldn't be an issue. I accept, though, that anything which requires you to rely on backup in a nuclear power station is probably not ideal. In terms of returning to the question, though, I mean, President Putin very famously is running out of missiles. He's importing them from North Korea, from Iran. He doesn't have huge supplies. So if he suddenly decides to just get petulant and throw a load of missiles at Ukraine, in a way, that is a good news for Ukraine. They'll have to deal with the near term, but it means that Russia is running even lower on missiles. I think the more worrying threat is this nuclear threat. Putin always suggested that if Russian territory came under threat, that's when it would trigger a nuclear war. But I think that's why it's fascinating seeing Putin's reaction to this. He described his special military operation into Ukraine as liberating towns and regions of Ukraine, and yet millions of people relocated, hundreds of thousands of people killed, communities devastated. Yet this Ukrainian advance into Russia, tiny by comparison, he's described it as a terrorist act and a provocation. It's quite clear that Putin does not want to talk to his people about going to war, doesn't want to put Russia on a war footing, does not want to start a nuclear confrontation. So in some respects, his main option here is to extinguish this Ukrainian advance as soon as humanly possible and then make sure they can't do it again.
Let's talk about some more bad news for Vladimir Putin, and that's the arrival of the F-16s into Ukraine. As a former fighter pilot yourself, Sean, how big a difference will they make?
Well, I think they're not going to make as much difference as we all hoped. Bluntly, I think Ukraine has been promised up to 80. They needed about 160. But even if they got the 80, they haven't got the pilots to fly them. That's the long pole in the tent for them. So it looks likely they've probably got about a dozen at the moment. And you need a couple because inevitably they're not always going to be serviceable. Some of them are going to need servicing, etc. So you're not going to have very many on a daily basis available to fly. So the question is, how are they going to be used? And also, how do you hide them from Russia? Because President Putin famously put a bounty on the head of the F-16 and said, for the first Russian that shoots one down, I'm going to give 15 million rubles. That's about £150,000. So he's clearly rattled by it. I suspect that the big thing they'll do is cause the Russian pilots to just think twice. The F-16 is quite small. It's very capable. Russian pilots are used to fighting Ukrainian aircraft that are older, less capable than the Russians. All of a sudden, this F-16 arrives. It's small, agile. It's got a very good radar and now has Western weapons that can hurt the Russians. I suspect that'll just cause them to think. And I think that's particularly how are they going to be used? Probably not too close to Russian defenses. But of course, with these glide bombs that the Russians have been using, I suspect the F-16s will be used to try to limit the Russian Air Force's ability to continue delivering these glide bombs.
Just to bring you some breaking news we've had as we've been recording, Sean, President Putin has issued a statement about the incursion into Kursk. He's convened a meeting with officials on the situation in the border regions. He's told the meeting the Defence Ministry's main task is to push to kick the enemy out of our territory. He also says that Ukraine's motivation for the offensive was to improve its negotiating position. I appreciate you've just heard that, but what is your reaction to that, Sean?
Well, the first part of it, I think, as we said, it doesn't surprise me at all. He's basically saying we've got to kick him out, and I am absolutely confident that he will move a lot of troops to make sure that he does that quickly. He won't want to do that over time. He'll want to use overwhelming force to force Ukraine out quickly and demonstrate that Putin's back in control. But you can't magic up these forces. They're going to have to be moved from somewhere, and therefore almost certainly from the front line. I think in terms of a negotiating strategy, over the last week, ever since this has happened, we've heard a whole series of different messages coming out from Russia, and most of them are contradictory. It's almost certain that Ukraine will not be able to hold this territory. I'd be amazed if that was their plan. And the only way to use it in a negotiating strategy would be to some way to hold it. And I think you're incredibly vulnerable for all sorts of reasons we could go into. So I don't think that's Ukraine's objective at all. It's useful for President Putin to frame it like that, because then when he kicks Ukraine out, he can say, look, they're not even strong enough to hold a little tiny bit of territory. So I think this is part of the game, the war of words and the information campaign around this. But it's entirely coherent with us saying that he's almost certainly going to want to use overwhelming force, kick Ukraine out quickly. The question is what happens then, because he will be vulnerable across the whole of the border.